What if history class started in Africa, not just with Egypt, but with the full story? Imagine hearing about African emperors, scholars, and engineers with the same respect given to Caesar or Napoleon, but that's not how it's usually taught. Africa's past is too often reduced to slavery, colonization, and struggle, skipping over centuries of innovation, leadership, and global influence. Why? Because for a long time, outsiders controlled the narrative. Colonial powers needed people to believe Africa had no meaningful history before they arrived, and that lie stuck. But the truth is far richer. Africa gave birth to civilizations, ideas, and technologies that shaped the world long before Europe ever set foot on the continent. In this documentary, we're uncovering powerful truths they left out of the textbooks. Some will inspire, some will sting, but all of them matter. Before we continue, we'd really appreciate it if you could hit like, subscribe, and support our journey in bringing these untold stories to light. Without further ado, let's start. Our journey begins where all human life began. Africa. It's one of the most fundamental facts in history, yet it's often mentioned only in passing. Africa is the cradle of humankind. Fossil records, archaeological findings, and genetic studies all point to Africa as the birthplace of humanity. Every person alive today, no matter where they're from, can trace their ancestral roots back to this continent. But Africa's story doesn't stop at being the starting point. It also happens to be one of the earliest places where people began shaping the world in ways we're still feeling today. Take mathematics, for example. In a cave in southern Africa, archaeologists found something called the Lubombo bone, a piece of baboon bone with 29 distinct notches carved into it. This artifact is over 40,000 years old and is widely considered the oldest mathematical tool ever discovered. Then there's the Ishango bone, found near the Nile, dated to around 20,000 years ago. This one shows a pattern that suggests early humans were performing basic calculations, possibly even using multiplication and division. These tools predate the earliest writing systems and cities, proving that Africans were thinking abstractly and keeping track of quantities thousands of years before math textbooks mention Pythagoras or Archimedes.
20,000 years ago, before the pharaohs of Egypt, another African civilization produced a sophisticated calculator.
Proof that primitive man was well acquainted with mathematics lies under lock and key in the dusty archives on the 19th floor of Belgium's Royal Institute of Natural Science. Best described as a prehistoric calculator, it's a piece of animal bone, just 10 centimeters long, about 4 inches. Discovered in the 1950s by a leading Belgian archaeologist, the bone was found near Lake Edward at Ishango, on the border between the Congo and Rwanda. What sets the bone apart from the other fossils and fragments found at Ishango are its markings, groups of notches arranged in 3 distinct columns.
Art, too, finds some of its earliest roots in Africa. In Namibia, rock paintings that date back 20,000 years show animals and mysterious shapes etched into stone. In Algeria, the vast plateau of Tassili N'Ajjer contains thousands of cave paintings, elegant, detailed scenes of hunters, dancers, and wildlife. These aren't primitive doodles. They're complex visual records of a once thriving society, created when the Sahara was still a green, fertile landscape. These images speak of religion, community, survival, and imagination. This art existed long before the rise of the great empires of Greece or Rome, and yet it's rarely taught in the same breath. Too often, civilization is framed as something that arrived in Africa from the outside. But the evidence tells a different story. Africa was creating beauty and meaning from the beginning. By the time we reach 3000 BCE, we encounter a name that at least rings a bell in most classrooms: ancient Egypt. Pyramids, mummies, and pharaohs are common topics, but here's where things get tricky. Egypt is frequently shown as somehow separate from the rest of Africa, more Mediterranean than African. This creates a false impression. Egypt was an African civilization, deeply influenced by other African cultures and people, especially from the south. One of those cultures was the Kingdom of Kush, located in what is now Sudan. Kush didn't just trade with Egypt, it conquered it. Starting around 1070 BCE, Kushite kings ruled as pharaohs of Egypt. They built temples and monuments, developed writing systems, and established a line of rulers known as the Black Pharaohs. They even built pyramids, more than Egypt ever did, in fact. In Sudan, the desert still holds the remains of these pyramid tombs, silent but powerful reminders of a rich African legacy. And yet, for years, many scholars refused to believe Africans could have built such structures. When European archaeologists first studied the Kushite pyramids in the 19th century, they were stunned by the craftsmanship. Some went so far as to argue that another, more advanced race must have constructed them. In East Africa, we find another ancient powerhouse, the Kingdom of Aksum. This civilization rose to prominence in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea around the 1st century CE. Aksum had a written language called Ge'ez, massive stone obelisks that still stand today, and a thriving trade network that stretched from Rome to India. It was also one of the first empires in the world to adopt Christianity as a state religion, around the same time as the Roman Empire. Ethiopian traditions even say the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Aksum, a claim that, whether literal or symbolic, speaks to the depth of the region's spiritual heritage. Despite this, Aksum is almost never mentioned alongside the great empires of the ancient world. Textbooks might list Rome, Persia, or China, but not Aksum, and yet, by every historical measure, it deserves a seat at that table. Then there's Carthage, on the North African coast, in modern-day Tunisia. Founded by Phoenician settlers around the 9th century BCE, Carthage became a powerful empire that controlled much of the Western Mediterranean. Its most famous general, Hannibal, is remembered for leading elephants across the Alps to challenge Rome. Carthage was African. It stood on African land, was supported by indigenous African peoples, and was a major force in ancient geopolitics. Still, it's rarely described as an African power in the way it deserves to be. But perhaps the most striking example of Africa's ancient brilliance is Great Zimbabwe. Located in southern Africa, this stone city was built between the 11th and 15th centuries. It featured towering granite walls, expertly fitted together without mortar, and served as the capital of a powerful kingdom. Its name, Zimbabwe, comes from the Shona phrase meaning house of stone. At its height, Great Zimbabwe was a bustling center of trade, with goods passing through from as far as China and Persia. Archaeologists have uncovered Chinese porcelain, Persian glassware, and Arab coins at the site, showing that this city was part of a far-reaching international trade network. When Europeans first encountered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the 1800s, they were so impressed and so blinded by racism that they refused to believe black Africans had built it. Theories emerged, blaming the city's construction on Phoenicians, Arabs, even lost tribes of Israel. One explorer, Karl Malk, declared in 1871 that the city must have been built by a more civilized race. The idea that Africans themselves could have designed and constructed such a marvel was too inconvenient for the colonial narrative. In 1905, archaeologist David Randall McIver studied the site and confirmed it was indeed built by local Africans. Still, the colonial government in what was then Rhodesia suppressed this truth. They feared that acknowledging African greatness would inspire resistance. Great Zimbabwe stands today as a silent rebuke to that erasure, a symbol of African ingenuity and sovereignty. And yet, unless you live in Zimbabwe or study specialized history, you probably never learned about it in school. All of this reveals a truth that's been left out of far too many classrooms. Africa was never waiting for civilization to arrive. It was shaping the world from the beginning. The continent gave us early mathematics, art, architecture, and global trade. Its kingdoms built cities, established complex governments, and left behind records of greatness long before Europe's Renaissance or Enlightenment. While the rest of the world was still finding its footing, African civilizations like Kush, Aksum, Carthage, and Great Zimbabwe were already thriving. By the time Europe was coming out of the Dark Ages, African cities like Timbuktu and Cairo had libraries, universities, and scholars debating astronomy, medicine, and law. And this leads us to the next part of our journey, Africa's Golden Age kingdoms and how they reached heights of prosperity and knowledge that most history books conveniently overlook. While Europe was stumbling through the Middle Ages, fighting off plagues and locked in feudal wars, vast African empires were thriving. Cities rose along trade routes, scholars gathered in grand libraries, gold flowed through kingdoms that most of us never learned about. These were Africa's Golden Ages, periods of wealth, power, and learning that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia at the time, and yet they're barely mentioned in history classes. Let's take a closer look at some of the most remarkable African empires that you were likely never taught about, each a forbidden truth showcasing African leadership and accomplishment. One of the most impressive was the Mali Empire. It began around the 13th century and became one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in West Africa. Mali controlled critical trade routes across the Sahara, dealing in gold, salt, ivory, and other valuable goods. It wasn't a minor kingdom. It stretched across modern-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, and parts of Niger and Burkina Faso. At its height, it was larger than any European kingdom of the time. The city of Timbuktu, often used as a joke or symbol of remoteness today, was actually one of the intellectual capitals of the medieval world. It had universities, mosques, and libraries filled with manuscripts on everything from astronomy and medicine to law and theology. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu attracted scholars from across North Africa and the Middle East. While Oxford and Cambridge were still relatively new institutions, Timbuktu had already been producing scholars and archiving knowledge for centuries. Then there's Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali, from 1312 to 1337. He's often referred to as the richest person in human history, and that's not hyperbole. His wealth was legendary. On his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, Mansa Musa traveled with a caravan so extravagant it made headlines across continents. Tens of thousands of people, dozens of camels loaded with gold, and generous donations along the way. He gave out so much gold in Cairo that it caused inflation and disrupted the economy for over a decade. Think about that. A single African king gave away so much gold, it broke a foreign economy. That story rarely makes it into textbooks. But Mansa Musa wasn't only a rich king, he was a builder and a patron of knowledge. He brought architects and scholars back to Mali, building mosques and centers of learning across the empire. Under his leadership, Timbuktu blossomed as a beacon of scholarship. After Mali, the Songhai Empire rose and took its place as West Africa's next great power. Songhai built on Mali's foundations and expanded even further. By the 15th century, it controlled an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the Sahara. The cities of Gao and Timbuktu remained hubs of trade and education, and Songhai's scholars produced detailed legal and religious texts. One such scholar, Ahmed Baba, owned a library of over 1,600 books, an astonishing number for that time. He wrote prolifically on law, grammar, and ethics, showing just how deep intellectual life ran in Songhai. But this was not just a West African phenomenon. On the other side of the continent, the Swahili coast was booming. Along the Indian Ocean, city-states like Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, and Zanzibar thrived through trade with Arabia, India, Persia, and even China. These cities had coral stone buildings, bustling ports, and cosmopolitan populations. Merchants spoke Swahili, a language that blended Bantu roots with Arabic and Persian influences, and dealt in gold, ivory, spices, and textiles. Visitors from the Arab world and beyond wrote about the wealth and beauty of these African cities. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler, visited Kilwa in the 1300s and described it as one of the most elegant towns he had ever seen. When the Portuguese arrived on the East African coast in the late 1400s, they were shocked. These weren't isolated villages. They were sophisticated, fortified, and flourishing. But instead of recognizing their achievements, many European chroniclers dismissed or destroyed what they saw. The Portuguese eventually attacked and looted many of the coastal cities, sending them into decline. Further inland, the Ethiopian Empire, formerly known as Abyssinia, was another African power with deep roots and global connections. Ethiopia had its own ancient script, its own Christian traditions, and its own architectural wonders. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved straight into solid rock, are still standing today. They're not only religious monuments but engineering feats built centuries before Europe's great cathedrals. Ethiopian rulers maintained contact with Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, often described in medieval European lore as the Kingdom of Prester John, a mysterious Christian land in the heart of Africa. In Central Africa, the Kingdom of Congo emerged as a major regional power in the 14th century. When the Portuguese made contact in the 1400s, they found an organized state with a capital city, Mbanza, Congo, and a complex political structure. The king of Congo, Nzongola-Ntalaja, converted to Christianity and established diplomatic relations with Portugal. His son, Afonso I, was highly educated and even sent Congolese students to study in Europe. One of his relatives, Enrique, became a bishop, possibly the first black African to hold such a position in the Catholic Church. And then, in southern Africa, the legacy of Great Zimbabwe continued through successor states like the Mutapa Empire. The Portuguese, arriving in the 1500s, wrote in awe of the empire's wealth and the scale of its gold mining operations. The emperor, whom they referred to as the Monomotapa, ruled over a vast territory and managed a trade system that extended to the Indian Ocean. When you put the pieces together, the picture becomes clear. Africa was a continent of innovation, trade, governance, and learning. Its people were connected to the wider world, and its cities rivaled the greatest of their time. The achievements of Mali, Songhai, the Swahili city-states, Aksum, Congo, and Ethiopia stand shoulder to shoulder with the best of medieval Europe and Asia. In the next part, we'll explore what happened when these empires began to fall, not from natural decline, but from violent outside interference. We'll look at how colonial conquest dismantled Africa's institutions, erased its stories, and rebranded greatness as savagery. And we'll uncover the deliberate silence that followed. Most of us remember seeing the phrase, "the scramble for Africa," in school. We might recall a map showing European powers carving up the continent, and a line saying that by 1900, over 90% of Africa was under foreign rule. But what's usually missing from that lesson is what colonialism actually meant for African people. We're rarely told about the terror, the brutality, the cultural theft, or the millions of lives destroyed. One of the darkest chapters came under King Leopold II of Belgium. He claimed the Congo as his personal colony from 1885 to 1908 and called it the Congo Free State. But there was nothing free about it. It was a massive forced labor camp, built to extract rubber and ivory. Villages were given impossible rubber quotas. When they failed to meet them, the punishment was cruel beyond belief. Soldiers of Leopold's private militia would hold families hostage. They beat men to death death with whips made from animal hide. They even cut off people's hands, sometimes children's, as proof that bullets weren't being wasted.
Soldiers sexually violated women and deprived children of food and water. Congolese people rebelled. They refused to cooperate, fought Leopold's soldiers, hid in the forests, and destroyed rubber vines. Leopold's army responded to resistance or failure to meet quotas with unflinching torture and executions. Because guns and ammunition were expensive, officers ordered soldiers to prove they'd used their bullets in the line of duty by removing a hand from anyone they killed.
Historians estimate that between 5 to 10 million Congolese died during Leopold's reign, through forced labor, execution, starvation, and disease made worse by the regime's cruelty. A human catastrophe unfolded in silence. Belgium, for over a century, barely acknowledged what happened. Only recently have leaders expressed regret or discussed returning stolen Congolese art, and you almost never hear about how the rubber from the Congo, rubber harvested at gunpoint, helped fuel the early automobile industry in Europe and America. That part doesn't fit the tidy story of industrial progress. Leopold's Congo wasn't an isolated horror. In what is now Namibia, Germany carried out the first genocide of the 20th century. In 1904, the Herero people rebelled after German settlers seized their land and cattle. The response was brutal. General Lothar von Trotha issued a chilling order: kill every Herero man, woman, and child. The survivors were driven into the desert, where water sources were poisoned or guarded to stop escape. Many died of thirst. Those who survived were rounded up into camps. There, they were forced into backbreaking labor, starved, and subjected to gruesome experiments. The death rate in those camps was over 50%. By the time it was over, an estimated 80% of the Herero and half of the Nama population were gone, about 75,000 people in total. For decades, Germany barely mentioned this in its history books. Only in 2021 did the government formally acknowledge the genocide and offer an apology. Meanwhile, skulls of victims, taken by German scientists for racist studies, sat quietly in museum basements for over 100 years. Imagine being a descendant, finally seeing your ancestors' remains returned in silence, with barely a whisper in global education. Even Britain, often portrayed as a more civilized colonizer, committed horrific acts that are rarely taught. In the 1950s, during Kenya's fight for independence, British forces cracked down on the Mau Mau uprising with overwhelming force. Hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu people were forced into detention camps. Inside those camps, there was torture, starvation, and systematic abuse. Some prisoners were beaten to death. Others were raped, castrated, or burned. These weren't rogue acts. They were government-sanctioned. But for decades, the British public didn't know. The truth only surfaced after survivors sued the UK government in court, forcing the release of classified documents. Britain finally apologized in 2013, but that chapter is still absent in many school books. And this wasn't the first time Britain used camps in Africa. During the Boer War in the early 1900s, they built concentration camps in South Africa. Most people know that Afrikaner women and children were held there. What's less known is that tens of thousands of black South Africans were also imprisoned, separately, under even worse conditions. Over 14,000 of them died, mostly from neglect. That story too gets skipped. France has its own bloody record. In Algeria, during the War for Independence from 1954 to 1962, French forces routinely used torture, execution, and collective punishment. One of the worst massacres happened in 1945 in the towns of Sétif and Guelma. Thousands of Algerians were protesting peacefully, demanding civil rights after World War II. French troops opened fire and launched a week of violence that killed thousands. Some estimates say over 40,000. That event was hushed up for decades, and in places like Madagascar, colonial uprisings were met with the same kind of violence. Tens of thousands were killed in 1947 alone. But colonial damage wasn't only physical, it was cultural too. Across the continent, African history, identity, and knowledge were deliberately attacked. Colonial powers stole thousands of artifacts, bronze statues, sacred masks, royal regalia, and shipped them off to European museums. Visitors admire these pieces today, but few are told how they were taken. One of the most infamous thefts happened in 1897 when British troops invaded Benin City in what is now Nigeria. The city was a center of art and culture, ruled by a dynasty going back centuries. The British looted the royal palace and burned much of the city to the ground. Thousands of items, now known as the Benin bronzes, were taken. These stunning brass plaques and sculptures were made with precision and skill that amazed even European art critics. But instead of crediting African craftsmanship, many assumed they must have been influenced by Europeans. They couldn't accept that African artists had mastered metallurgy and historical storytelling on their own terms. Back in Benin, the destruction was catastrophic. Temples, libraries, and royal tombs were reduced to ash. One historian compared it to burning down Westminster Abbey, the British Library, and the National Gallery all at once, then stealing the crown jewels. Yet in many world history classes, this is reduced to a vague sentence about a British punitive expedition. And while they were taking objects, colonial powers were also trying to take identities. In schools, African children were taught that their cultures were backward. Their languages were discouraged or banned. Their religions were mocked as superstition. Colonial authorities pushed European values, languages, and histories while dismissing indigenous knowledge. In French colonies, the policy of assimilation meant becoming French was the goal, at the cost of forgetting who you were. Even written African history was suppressed. Take Timbuktu's ancient manuscripts, thousands of handwritten books on science, medicine, law, and religion. During colonial rule, many of these were neglected, stolen, or locked away. Some ended up in European libraries as curiosities, not as evidence of African intellectual traditions. The idea that Africans had written texts didn't fit the colonial narrative, so it was ignored. But through it all, Africans resisted. They didn't just accept colonial rule and fought back. Ethiopia, under Emperor Menelik II, famously defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, keeping the country independent while the rest of Africa was carved up. In what's now Tanzania, the Maji Maji rebellion brought together multiple ethnic groups to resist German rule. In West Africa, Samurai Touré led a powerful military campaign against French colonization for over a decade. And when global wars broke out, Africans were pulled into battles that weren't theirs. Over 2 million African soldiers and laborers served in World War I and II for their colonial rulers. They fought and died in foreign lands, yet after the wars, many were forgotten. In France, African soldiers who helped liberate the country were denied the same pay and recognition as white troops. In Britain's campaigns, African porters carried supplies through disease-ridden jungles, often without enough food or medicine. Their stories are rarely told on Remembrance Day. Yet through all of this, Africa endured. Its people held on to culture, resisted oppression, and continued to shape the world in ways history books often ignore. Next up, we'll explore the many ways Africans and the African diaspora have contributed to science, culture, and global progress, even while their stories remained untold. When we talk about how the modern world came to be, Africa is often treated as a background subject. Textbooks usually show Africa receiving influence, not shaping it. But the truth is, African people on the continent and across the diaspora have played a crucial role in the development of the world we live in. These contributions span agriculture, science, music, politics, and more, but they're rarely acknowledged. This chapter shines a light on what Africa has given, even when the world refused to give credit in return. Start with the transatlantic slave trade. It was one of the most devastating periods in African history, but it also led to something the textbooks often ignore. The forced migration of millions of Africans brought ideas, skills, and traditions that shaped the Americas in deep and lasting ways. Enslaved Africans didn't just work on plantations. They brought rice-growing techniques, ironworking, herbal medicine, and cultural knowledge that influenced every place they were taken. In places like South Carolina, the success of rice plantations depended on the expertise of Africans from the region now known as Sierra Leone. The plantation owners didn't know how to manage swamp fields or build irrigation systems. The enslaved Africans did. African influence also reached the kitchen. Foods like okra, black-eyed peas, yams, and watermelon trace their origins to African farms. The flavors and cooking techniques that developed in African homes traveled with the enslaved and became central to cuisines in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States. In science and medicine, Africa's impact is older and deeper than most realize. One striking example is the story of Onesimus, an enslaved African in Boston during the early 1700s. He shared a traditional African method of smallpox inoculation with his enslaver, Cotton Mather. The technique involved exposing a person to a mild dose of smallpox through a skin cut. It worked. During a deadly outbreak in 1721, this method saved countless lives. Onesimus's insight laid the groundwork for the future of vaccination, yet most people have never heard his name. Even the origins of coffee go back to Africa. The coffee plant is native to Ethiopia. The tradition of roasting and brewing it began there long before it became a global habit. The very word coffee comes from the Ethiopian region of Kaffa. That morning ritual, so common in homes and offices around the world, began with African farmers and spiritual ceremonies. These aren't footnotes in someone else's story. They are part of a larger truth that gets buried beneath layers of European credit and colonial framing. Africa has also left a deep imprint on the world's economy. The continent has long been a source of essential materials. Gold and diamonds have flowed out of African mines for centuries. European wealth, especially during the colonial and industrial eras, depended on the gold from West Africa and the minerals of Southern Africa. Today, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo powers the batteries in smartphones and electric vehicles. Platinum from South Africa is essential for industrial processes. Cocoa from Ivory Coast and Ghana supplies the chocolate industry. These aren't minor contributions. They sit at the foundation of modern supply chains, even though African workers and communities often receive little recognition or compensation. Now think about culture. It's impossible to imagine modern music without African influence. The spirituals sung by enslaved Africans evolved into gospel, blues, jazz, and eventually hip-hop. These forms didn't develop in a vacuum. They grew out of lived experiences, oral traditions, and rhythmic patterns that traveled across oceans and generations. Jazz emerged from New Orleans with roots in African rhythm and storytelling. Blues carried the sorrow and survival of black communities in the American South. Hip-hop grew from the streets of the Bronx but carries echoes of West African griots who used rhyme and cadence to tell stories. These styles have shaped global music, but their African origins are often glossed over or packaged in a way that distances them from their roots. In Latin America and the Caribbean, African cultural traces are just as visible. Reggae, samba, salsa, and rumba all carry the weight of African drums and dances. These genres emerged where African people endured oppression but held on to parts of their identity. They created new expressions using old foundations. The world dances to these rhythms now, often without realizing where they come from. In visual arts, African styles helped change how the West saw beauty and form. European artists in the early 20th century, including Picasso and Matisse, were inspired by African masks and sculptures. These pieces challenged Western ideas of symmetry and proportion, but rather than acknowledging the artistic mastery behind them, critics labeled the influence as primitive. African art wasn't treated as its own school of thought. It was treated as raw material for European creativity. The list of individual contributors is long, though many remain overlooked. Dr. Charles Drew, an African American, developed methods for storing and preserving blood plasma. His work saved lives during World War II. In apartheid-era South Africa, Hamilton Naki, a black man, trained white surgeons and assisted in the world's first heart transplant, though he wasn't officially credited at the time. Writers like Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie have challenged literary traditions and expanded the global canon. Their stories are rooted in African experiences but speak across boundaries. In politics and human rights, African voices have shifted global conversations. Nelson Mandela's long walk to freedom did more than end apartheid. It reshaped ideas about justice and reconciliation. Civil rights leaders in the United States often drew inspiration from African liberation movements. The connections between Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah were real and purposeful. These were movements that recognized shared struggles and supported one another from afar. Even outside politics, African philosophies have made their way into the global imagination. The concept of Ubuntu, for instance, teaches that a person is only a person through other people. It centers the value of community, responsibility, and dignity. In a time when many societies are struggling with isolation and division, such ideas offer something deeply relevant. African athletes have also carried the continent's name to global stages, from marathon champions in East Africa to football stars in Europe's biggest leagues. These figures are celebrated for their skill, but what often gets missed is how their stories reflect a much larger pattern of determination. For many, success wasn't handed down by systems. It came in spite of them. None of these contributions happened by accident. They came from lived history, inherited knowledge, and a long tradition of creativity and resilience. But when the world writes its history, these facts are often left out. Not because they're unimportant, but because they challenge the narrative that Africa has been a passive player. They show that African people have always shaped the world in essential ways. Africa has always had a story worth telling, but for too long, others wrote it. Colonial governments controlled the textbooks. Outsiders shaped the museums. Foreign media defined what was newsworthy. For generations, the world heard about Africa through someone else's lens. Now, that is changing. In cities across the continent and within global diasporas, Africans are reclaiming the narrative, not with nostalgia, but with purpose. What was hidden is being brought into view, and what was dismissed is being re-examined. Look to Senegal, where young artists and filmmakers are drawing from Wolof, Serer, and Pular traditions to create stories that reflect local truths. In Kenya, digital platforms like Africa Uncensored investigate corruption, displacement, and ecological threats without waiting for foreign journalists to frame the issues. In Nigeria, the creative energy pouring out of Lagos through literature, fashion, and Afrobeats isn't imitating anyone else. It stands on its own. Young Africans today are reconnecting with the histories they never learned in school. They're digging through archives, preserving oral traditions, and reviving indigenous languages. In Ethiopia, community-led projects are cataloging ancient manuscripts long left unprotected. In Mali, families who once hid medieval scrolls from invading forces are now working with scholars to preserve them for future generations. These actions don't come from grants or permission. They come from a desire to reclaim what was nearly lost. In the United States, initiatives like the 1619 Project aim to reposition the African American experience as central to the country's history, not an afterthought. These efforts are not about revising facts. They're about making space for facts that were erased or ignored. Even in education, there's a shift. Universities in Ghana and South Africa are reshaping their curricula to reflect local knowledge systems. Students aren't only reading European theorists, they're reading thinkers like Amilcar Cabral, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Sylvia Tamale. These voices ask questions that can't be answered by imported frameworks. They speak to lived African experiences, rooted in realities that have often been filtered or flattened in traditional academic spaces. Museums around the world are now under pressure to return looted African treasures. Nigeria is beginning to receive Benin bronzes from Western institutions. In France and Germany, governments are starting to review the origins of African artifacts sitting behind glass. These changes didn't come from quiet negotiation. They came from voices raised, from campaigns that refused to let history remain untold. The question is no longer whether these objects belong to Africa. The question is why it took so long for anyone to admit they were stolen. The same can be said for intellectual property. African herbal knowledge has often been exploited by pharmaceutical companies without proper credit or compensation. That too is being challenged. Scientists and healers are collaborating to document traditional medicine before it disappears. In places like Cameroon and Zimbabwe, databases are being created to protect indigenous knowledge from corporate theft. But this reclamation also happens in everyday acts. In language, where young people switch between Swahili, Yoruba, English, and French, not to assimilate but to communicate in a way that feels real. In fashion, where head wraps and textiles carry stories that can't be translated. In dance, where movements passed down from elders appear on TikTok, not as trends, but as memories revived. These small actions form a broader resistance to forgetting. There's still struggle. Poverty, exploitation, and political instability remain in many places, but the difference is how those issues are being approached. African thinkers are writing policy proposals that challenge debt systems designed to keep countries dependent. African journalists are risking their lives to expose corruption from within, not waiting for outside validation. African educators are teaching history that includes more than colonial timelines. It matters who tells the story. When Africans speak for themselves, the story widens. It includes kingdoms that rose and fell, poets whose verses survive in centuries-old manuscripts, and farmers whose techniques sustained civilizations long before tractors arrived. It includes resistance fighters, revolutionaries, and thinkers who challenged the empire not just with weapons, but with words. Africa's Renaissance is not something in the distant future. It's here, happening now. It's in the music that moves the world. It's in the literature reshaping how we define power. It's in the science trying to solve problems that Western models haven't fixed. This rebirth doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't seek validation. It grows from a recognition that the truth, once buried, can't stay hidden forever. This video began with a simple question. Why don't they teach this in school? The deeper you look, the more you realize that the exclusion wasn't accidental. The erasure served a purpose. If people knew what Africa had built, contributed, and defended, they would ask harder questions about the world as it is today. They would see that Africa was not a place waiting to be civilized, but a place interrupted. In the end, despite the interruptions, Africa continues to create, innovate, and inspire. It is home to the world's youngest population, bustling tech hubs, groundbreaking artists, and vibrant cultural movements. It will not be known as a continent of struggle because it's a place of energy, beauty, and unmatched resilience.
We can see that beauty doesn't only exist in Europe, and we can see that all of this can exist anywhere. That's why the next time you think of Africa, think of its technology. Think of this beautiful countryside, because Africa is more than poverty, war, and starving kids.
If you found this video meaningful, consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear these stories. Every watch, like, and comment helps us keep uncovering the truths that history tried to bury. Thanks for being part of the journey.